The chandeliers of Blackwood House burned with a brilliance meant to dazzle London's most discerning eyes, yet beneath their golden glow the air shimmered with something far colder than elegance. It was the cold curiosity of the aristocracy, that peculiar hunger for spectacle which turned private sorrow into public entertainment. Gentlemen in dark coats murmured behind gloved hands, while ladies fanned themselves with delicate impatience, their voices low but sharp as needles. The orchestra played a graceful waltz, but the music could not drown the restless whisper that passed through the ballroom like a sudden chill. The Duchess of Blackwood had arrived alone. Lady Eliza Ashbourne, now Duchess Eliza Blackwood, stood near the edge of the grand marble floor where couples glided in careful circles beneath towering mirrors. She wore a gown of pale ivory silk that shimmered like moonlight against the polished floor. Pearls rested at her throat, modest and luminous, chosen with the restraint expected of a woman whose rank demanded dignity rather than display. To an unfamiliar observer she might have seemed serene, even distant, yet anyone who studied her closely would have noticed the stillness in her hands and the faint tension in the line of her shoulders. She had once been the brightest hope of London's marriage season. Years earlier, when the Duke of Blackwood had first chosen her, society had praised the match as almost poetic. He had been the most admired nobleman of his generation, wealthy, handsome, and commanding. She had been gentle, thoughtful, and quietly beautiful, the daughter of an old but modest family. Together they had seemed balanced, as though strength and grace had been joined by careful design. The newspapers had celebrated their wedding as a triumph of romance within the rigid machinery of aristocratic duty. But romance, like perfume in a crowded room, fades faster than anyone wishes to admit. The murmurs surrounding Eliza that evening carried the weight of long-standing gossip. It had begun months earlier with a careless rumor, then grown steadily sharper until it hardened into open speculation. The Duke, it was said, had developed an unfortunate fondness for admiration beyond the boundaries of marriage. At first the whispers had named actresses and visiting baronesses, women whose reputations were already flexible enough to absorb scandal. Yet the tone had changed when one name began appearing again and again in the conversation: Lady Charlotte Whitmore. Even now, as Eliza stood quietly beside a marble column, two ladies behind her exchanged hushed observations. "Do you suppose His Grace will appear tonight?" one asked. "Oh, he will appear," replied the other softly. "But not alone." Their faint laughter drifted away like smoke. Eliza heard them, though she gave no sign. She had spent months learning the art of silence, the particular discipline required of a woman who must endure humiliation without granting society the satisfaction of witnessing her pain. Her eyes moved slowly across the ballroom, observing the dancers, the glittering chandeliers, the endless parade of gowns and jewels. Outwardly she was the perfect duchess, composed, gracious, untouched by petty disturbances. Inside, however, something fragile trembled. The great doors at the far end of the ballroom opened. At once the music faltered for half a heartbeat, the way a conversation pauses when an unexpected guest enters a room. Alexander Blackwood, Duke of Blackwood, stepped inside with the effortless authority of a man accustomed to admiration. Tall and broad-shouldered, he carried himself with the relaxed confidence of someone who had rarely encountered consequences. His dark hair caught the candlelight as he removed his gloves, and several ladies nearby lowered their eyes with shy fascination. But he was not alone. On his arm rested Lady Charlotte Whitmore, radiant in a gown of crimson satin that shimmered like liquid fire. Her laughter sparkled before she had even crossed the threshold, and her smile carried a brightness that seemed designed to command attention. Where Eliza embodied restraint, Charlotte embodied spectacle. The whispers that followed their entrance spread through the room like the ripple of a stone dropped into still water. Eliza felt the shift instantly. Alexander's gaze moved across the crowd until it rested upon her. For a brief moment the room seemed to narrow, leaving only the silent distance between husband and wife. There was no apology in his expression, no uncertainty. If anything, there was the faintest hint of amusement, as though he regarded the entire situation as an inconvenience too trivial to deserve serious thought. He inclined his head politely. "My Duchess," he said when he reached her, his voice smooth and light, "I trust the evening has not been unbearably dull in my absence." The formality of his tone drew a soft murmur from nearby listeners. Eliza answered with quiet grace. "Your presence, Your Grace, ensures the evening will now be memorable." Charlotte laughed at that, a musical sound that turned several heads. "Oh, how delightful," she said, glancing between them. "You two speak to one another as though you were characters in a very serious play." Alexander offered his arm to Charlotte without hesitation. "Come, my dear. The orchestra has recovered its composure, and London would surely be disappointed if we did not dance. They stepped onto the floor together. The waltz began. Beneath the glittering chandeliers, the Duke spun Lady Charlotte through the music with careless confidence while the assembled aristocracy watched with a fascination that bordered on cruelty. Every turn of Charlotte's crimson gown seemed to sharpen the unspoken comparison with the pale stillness of the Duchess standing alone beside the column. More whispers drifted through the crowd. Extraordinary behavior. But not surprising. A Duchess must endure. Eliza remained where she was, her posture straight, her expression calm. Only her eyes betrayed the faintest shadow of realization. Alexander believed she would never leave him. And that quiet certainty, more than the scandal itself, had begun to carve a dangerous thought into the deepest part of her heart. Morning light spread slowly across the sprawling grounds of Blackwood Manor, soft and pale against the long windows that overlooked miles of damp countryside. The estate had stood for centuries, its stone walls weathered by time and legacy, its halls lined with portraits of dukes who had ruled their households with iron certainty. Yet the quiet elegance of that morning concealed a fragile tension, as though the very house sensed that something within its grand foundations had begun to fracture. Lady Eliza Blackwood sat beside the tall window of the breakfast room, her posture graceful, her hands folded lightly around a porcelain teacup. Outside, the gardens were heavy with dew, roses drooping beneath the weight of the night's rain. She had chosen a gown of soft blue muslin, modest and refined, the sort of dress expected of a duchess attending to the calm rituals of mourning. To the servants who moved quietly around the room, she appeared composed, untouched by the humiliating spectacle that had unfolded in London only days before. But composure, she had learned, was a discipline rather than a comfort. Across the long mahogany table lay a stack of letters, each sealed with the elegant crests of London families. Invitations to dinners, musicales, and garden parties had arrived as faithfully as ever, yet Eliza noticed how carefully the language avoided mentioning the ball. Society possessed an extraordinary talent for pretending scandal did not exist while simultaneously savoring every detail of it. A footman entered with a silver tray bearing the Morning Post. "Your correspondence, Your Grace." Eliza thanked him with a gentle nod, breaking the seal of the first letter. Its contents proved harmless enough, an invitation to a charity luncheon, but the second letter carried the unmistakable tone of curiosity disguised as sympathy. The writer expressed concern for Eliza's well-being while delicately hinting that London had been most animated since the Duke's public appearance with Lady Charlotte Whitmore. Eliza folded the letter neatly and set it aside. The sound of laughter drifted faintly through the open corridor beyond the breakfast room. It was not the laughter of servants. It was lighter, careless, entirely at ease within the walls of a house that technically did not belong to its owner. Lady Charlotte had arrived the previous evening. The news had spread through the household with quiet astonishment. Guests were not unusual at Blackwood Manor. The Duke enjoyed entertaining friends whose fortunes and reputations were as dazzling as his own. Yet there had been something startling in the way Charlotte had swept into the entrance hall, her crimson cloak thrown back like a theatrical flourish, her voice echoing cheerfully beneath the marble ceiling. Alexander himself had greeted her with open amusement. "Blackwood Manor grows dull in autumn," he had said, pouring wine for his companions. "It requires brighter company." Eliza had remained seated beside the fireplace, her expression calm as porcelain. Now the echoes of Charlotte's laughter floated down the corridor again, accompanied by the deeper murmur of Alexander's voice. The sound reached Eliza like a distant storm, impossible to ignore yet strangely detached from the quiet space she occupied. Moments later the Duke himself appeared in the doorway. He looked relaxed, freshly dressed for the day, his dark coat perfectly tailored, his expression carrying the faint glow of someone who had enjoyed both wine and admiration the previous evening. Charlotte lingered just behind him, leaning casually against the frame as though she had every right to stand there. "My Duchess," Alexander said lightly, "you have begun breakfast without us." Eliza placed her teacup down with careful precision. "I was unaware that the morning required an audience." Charlotte laughed, stepping fully into the room. "Oh, how serious everything sounds here. One might almost forget we are meant to enjoy ourselves." Alexander crossed the room and poured himself coffee. "You must forgive Charlotte," he said, smiling. "She believes every house should feel like a celebration." "Then she must be delighted with yours," Eliza replied softly. The remark lingered in the air longer than any of them expected. Charlotte moved closer to the long table, her gaze drifting over the silver dishes and delicate china. Her eyes paused upon a small velvet case resting beside Eliza's letters. "How charming," she said, lifting the lid before anyone could object. Inside lay a sapphire necklace, its deep blue stones glowing like fragments of midnight. Eliza recognized it instantly. The necklace had belonged to her mother. Alexander noticed the flicker of recognition in her eyes and gave a small shrug. "A gift," he explained casually. "I thought it suited Charlotte better than gathering dust in the jewel cabinet." Charlotte fastened the necklace around her throat, admiring its reflection in the tall mirror beside the window. "Perfect," she murmured. For a brief moment Eliza said nothing. The silence stretched quietly between them, filled with the faint rustle of curtains and the distant call of birds beyond the garden. Then she rose from her chair with unhurried dignity. "I am pleased the jewels of this house continue to find appreciation," she said calmly. Alexander studied her with mild curiosity. "You see? Always reasonable. I told you, Charlotte, my wife possesses the patience of a saint." Charlotte smiled brightly. "How fortunate for you." Their laughter followed Eliza as she left the room. She walked slowly through the long corridor of portraits, past the solemn faces of generations who had built the Blackwood name upon wealth and obedience. The servants she passed lowered their eyes respectfully, yet she sensed their unease. They had witnessed the exchange in the breakfast room. Houses as old as Blackwood Manor had ways of remembering such moments. When she reached the quiet library at the far end of the hall, Eliza paused beside the window overlooking the stables. The old stable master was speaking with a groom beside a waiting carriage. The sight lingered in her thoughts. Alexander believed his arrogance harmless, his betrayals temporary amusements. Society believed the same, repeating its ancient wisdom that a duchess endured whatever storms her husband created. Yet as Eliza stood there watching the distant carriage wheels glint in the pale sunlight, a subtle transformation began unfolding within her heart. Patience, she realized, was not the same as surrender. And somewhere deep within the quiet corridors of Blackwood Manor, a new and dangerous possibility had begun to take shape. The afternoon settled over Blackwood Manor with the quiet heaviness of approaching rain. Low clouds pressed against the countryside, turning the garden silver beneath a restless wind that whispered through the rose hedges. Inside the manor the corridors were hushed, yet the hush felt uneasy, as if every stone and portrait understood that the harmony of the house had begun to slip into something fragile and uncertain. Lady Eliza Blackwood sat alone in the small music room at the western end of the estate. The chamber had once been her refuge, a place where sunlight spilled through tall windows and softened the polished curves of the grand piano. Now the light felt dimmer, filtered through gathering clouds that cast long shadows across the ivory keys. Her fingers rested upon the instrument without moving. Music had once come easily to her, each melody a quiet comfort against the rigid expectations of aristocratic life. Yet that afternoon the silence between the notes seemed heavier than any song she could attempt. Beyond the half-open door drifted the distant sound of laughter. Lady Charlotte's voice rose clearly through the corridor, bright and unrestrained, followed by the deeper rumble of the Duke's amusement. Their laughter echoed through the house with an intimacy that servants pretended not to hear. Eliza closed the piano lid softly. She had spent months convincing herself that humiliation could be endured if it remained discreet, if the rules of society preserved at least the appearance of respect. But the events of recent days had shattered that illusion. Alexander no longer troubled himself with appearances. His carelessness had grown bold, almost theatrical, as though he were testing the limits of her silence. A knock sounded gently at the door. Eliza turned to see the elderly family physician standing hesitantly in the doorway. Dr. Pembroke had served the Ashbourne and Blackwood families for more than 30 years, his thin frame and silver hair lending him an air of patient gravity. "Your Grace," he said quietly. "You asked to see me?" "Yes, doctor. Thank you for coming." She gestured toward the chair near the window, and he sat with careful dignity, folding his worn gloves in his hands. For a moment neither spoke. The wind stirred the curtains while distant thunder rolled faintly across the hills. Dr. Pembroke studied Eliza with thoughtful concern. "You mentioned in your letter that you had been feeling unwell." "It is nothing severe," she replied. "Merely unusual." Her voice remained calm, yet the faint tremor beneath it did not escape the doctor's notice. He rose after a brief conversation and moved to the window where the light was clearer. The examination was gentle and respectful, conducted with the discretion required when a physician attended a duchess. When it ended, Dr. Pembroke stepped back slowly. His expression had changed. "Eliza," he said softly, abandoning formality for the familiarity he had once shared with her parents, "there is no cause for alarm. In fact, the news is quite the opposite." She waited, her hands clasped lightly before her. "You are expecting a child." The words seemed to hover in the quiet room like a fragile miracle. For a brief moment Eliza did not breathe. A child. The heir of Blackwood Manor. The continuation of the powerful name that hung in portraits along every corridor. A delicate warmth rose in her chest, mingled with something far more complicated than joy. She imagined a small life growing quietly within her, a future that belonged not to society's judgments but to the gentle promise of motherhood. Dr. Pembroke watched her carefully. "Your health appears strong," he continued. "With proper care, I see no reason why the pregnancy should not progress safely." Eliza lowered her gaze to the polished floor. "Thank you, doctor." Yet even as she spoke, laughter drifted once again from the distant corridor. Alexander's voice followed it, careless and amused. The fragile warmth in her chest shifted into something colder. Dr. Pembroke hesitated before speaking again. "Does His Grace know?" "No." The answer came with quiet certainty. The physician nodded slowly, though concern lingered in his eyes. "He will be pleased, I am sure. An heir is always welcome news." Eliza did not respond. After a few moments the doctor gathered his gloves and bowed politely. "Rest well, Your Grace. I shall send instructions to the housekeeper regarding your diet." When he left, the door closed with a soft click that seemed to seal the silence around her. Eliza remained standing beside the window. Outside, rain had begun to fall across the gardens, turning the gravel paths dark and glistening. The distant carriage house blurred behind a veil of mist. A child. The word echoed gently through her thoughts. For years she had hoped for this moment, believing that motherhood might anchor her marriage, might soften Alexander's restless appetite for admiration. Yet the man she had seen in the ballroom and the breakfast room was not a husband seeking redemption. He was a man convinced that the loyalty of his wife was permanent, unquestionable. The laughter returned again, louder now. Curiosity drew Eliza toward the corridor. She moved quietly along the hall until the voices became clear. Alexander and two visiting gentlemen stood near the library doors, glasses of brandy in their hands. Charlotte lingered nearby, listening with sparkling interest. One of the gentlemen spoke first. "You treat scandal like a sport, Blackwood. Does your Duchess never protest?" Alexander chuckled easily. "Protest? My dear fellow, Eliza is the most patient woman in England." Charlotte tilted her head with playful curiosity. "Truly?" "Of course," Alexander replied. "A duchess understands her duties. She will never leave." The men laughed. Eliza stood unseen in the shadowed corridor, the words settling heavily into the quiet chamber of her heart. Never leave. Slowly she turned away. Back in the silent music room she rested her hand against her abdomen, feeling the faintest pulse of possibility beneath her palm. Her child would inherit the Blackwood name. But whether that child would grow up beneath the roof of Blackwood Manor was a decision she had only just begun to consider. Night settled upon Blackwood Manor with a quiet authority that even the proudest aristocratic house could not resist. Clouds rolled low across the countryside, dimming the moon and leaving the estate wrapped in a restless darkness broken only by the flicker of lanterns along the long gravel drive. Within the manor walls, music drifted through the corridors like a careless echo of celebration. Alexander Blackwood had once again filled his house with companions who admired his charm and ignored his recklessness. In the grand salon, crystal glasses gleamed beneath candlelight as laughter rose above the distant rumble of thunder. Gentlemen lounged in velvet chairs while servants replenished wine without a word. Lady Charlotte Whitmore sat at the center of the gathering, her crimson gown glowing richly in the firelight. The sapphire necklace at her throat caught every spark of flame, its deep blue stones shining like a quiet insult to the woman who had once worn them with pride. Alexander stood beside the mantel, relaxed and radiant with confidence. His dark coat hung open, and his voice carried easily above the room's murmurs. "You see, my friends," he declared with amused arrogance, "marriage is a curious arrangement. Society insists upon its importance, yet it need not disturb a man's enjoyment of life." One gentleman chuckled behind his glass. "You speak boldly for a husband, Blackwood." Alexander lifted his shoulders in an easy shrug. "My wife possesses a rare understanding of duty. She knows where she belongs." Charlotte smiled at him with playful admiration. "And where might that be, Your Grace?" "Here," he said, gesturing casually toward the manor around them. "A duchess belongs to her house. And a house such as Blackwood is not easily abandoned." Their laughter mingled with the crackle of the fire. None of them noticed the quiet corridor above the salon where Lady Eliza stood in stillness, the faint glow of candlelight outlining her pale face. She had paused there while passing from one wing of the house to another, drawn unwillingly by the unmistakable sound of her husband's voice. His words floated upward through the staircase. "A duchess belongs to her house." The sentence lingered in her thoughts with a strange, hollow echo. Eliza turned away slowly, the hem of her simple evening gown whispering across the polished floor. She had long ago mastered the art of leaving rooms without attracting attention, though tonight there was no audience to observe her departure. The house seemed unusually quiet beyond the salon's bright noise, its long halls stretching into darkness like the silent corridors of memory. She walked toward her private chambers. The door closed softly behind her. Inside, the room glowed with the gentle warmth of a single lamp placed beside the bed. Shadows pooled along the tall walls where delicate tapestries depicted gardens that no longer seemed cheerful. The air carried the faint scent of lavender, yet even that familiar fragrance felt distant, as though belonging to another life entirely. Eliza crossed to the window and parted the curtain. Rain had begun to fall again, silver threads slanting across the gardens. Beyond the hedges the carriage house stood quiet beneath a low lantern, its light flickering in the wind. She rested her hand lightly against her abdomen. The secret she carried there had transformed everything. A child. The future heir of the Blackwood name. For years she had believed her purpose within the manor was to preserve its dignity, to endure whatever storms Alexander's restless pride might summon. But now another responsibility had awakened inside her. A responsibility deeper than tradition, stronger than the silent expectations of society. Her child deserved more than a house filled with laughter that mocked its mother. The realization settled into her heart with sudden clarity. Eliza moved with calm purpose. From the wardrobe she removed a dark traveling cloak, its heavy wool designed to resist cold winds and long journeys. The garment looked strangely modest compared to the silks and gowns that filled the rest of the room, yet she slipped it over her shoulders with quiet determination. Next she opened a small writing desk near the bed. Inside lay a few folded documents, letters from her family, and a velvet pouch containing several jewels that had escaped Alexander's careless generosity. She gathered them carefully, selecting only what could fit into a small leather case. Her movements were precise, almost ceremonial. Every item she left behind felt like the closing of a door. When the case was ready she extinguished the lamp, leaving the room in darkness except for the pale glow of lightning outside the window. For a moment she stood there listening. Below, the salon still hummed with distant laughter. Glasses clinked. Charlotte's voice rose brightly through the floorboards. Alexander was enjoying his evening. He would not notice her absence for hours. Eliza stepped quietly into the corridor. The manor at night possessed a different personality than the bustling house of daylight. Its great staircases creaked softly, and its portraits watched with solemn patience as though recording every silent footstep. Candle sconces flickered along the walls, casting long shadows that moved like ghosts beside her. Halfway down the back staircase she encountered a familiar figure waiting in the dimness. Thomas Harrow, the old stable master, removed his cap respectfully when he saw her. "Your Grace," he said in a low voice. "The carriage?" Eliza asked gently. "Ready and waiting just as you requested." There was no surprise in his expression. Servants often understood more about their masters than society imagined. He hesitated before speaking again. "The road will be difficult tonight. The storm is growing stronger." Eliza met his gaze with quiet resolve. "Then we must leave before it grows worse." Together they slipped through the rear entrance of the manor, the heavy door closing behind them with a muffled thud. Rain greeted them immediately, cold and insistent. The gardens looked different in darkness, the once elegant paths now slick and shadowed beneath the restless sky. Lantern light from the carriage house shimmered across the puddles as they hurried forward. The carriage waited beside the stable doors, its horses stamping impatiently against the wind. A young groom held the lantern high while Thomas opened the door. Eliza paused before stepping inside. From where she stood she could still see the upper windows of Blackwood Manor glowing warmly against the storm. Music drifted faintly across the grounds, carried by the wind like a careless memory. For a brief instant she wondered if Alexander might appear at one of those windows and realize what was happening. But the music continued. The laughter continued. Blackwood Manor remained blissfully unaware that its Duchess was standing in the rain preparing to leave it forever. Eliza climbed into the carriage. Thomas closed the door and signaled to the driver. The horses lurched forward, wheels crunching against wet gravel as the carriage rolled slowly down the long drive. Behind them the towering silhouette of the manor began to fade into darkness. Inside the carriage, Eliza rested her hands over her abdomen once more, feeling the steady courage that had carried her through humiliation and silence. Tonight she had taken the only thing Alexander Blackwood truly valued. Not his jewels, not his estate, but the future of his name. And as thunder rolled across the countryside and the carriage disappeared into the storm, the Duke of Blackwood continued laughing beside his mistress, completely unaware that the greatest loss of his life had already slipped beyond the gates of his own estate. Morning arrived slowly at Blackwood Manor, its pale light slipping through the tall windows as though uncertain it still belonged there. The storm had passed during the night, leaving the gardens washed clean and silent beneath a thin veil of mist. Birds stirred cautiously among the hedges, yet inside the house the quiet carried an unfamiliar weight. Alexander Blackwood awoke later than usual. The previous evening's celebration had stretched long into the night, and the Duke rose with the heavy indifference of a man accustomed to indulgence without consequence. He dressed leisurely, the memory of laughter and music still lingering in his thoughts like the fading echo of a pleasant dream. Servants moved through the corridors with careful politeness as he descended the staircase. Their greetings were respectful, though something in their expressions seemed strangely restrained. Alexander noticed it only briefly before dismissing the thought. Servants often carried a peculiar sensitivity to moods that did not concern them. In the breakfast room he found the table already laid with silver dishes and fresh tea. Lady Charlotte Whitmore lounged comfortably near the window, the sapphire necklace glimmering softly against her throat. She greeted him with a playful smile. "You kept dreadful company last night, Your Grace," she teased. "Your friends departed hours after I retired." Alexander poured himself coffee with casual ease. "You should consider their stamina admirable." Charlotte laughed lightly and reached for a piece of fruit. "You truly possess a remarkable house," she said, glancing around the room. "So vast, so solemn. One might almost believe it could swallow a person whole." Alexander followed her gaze across the polished table. Something was missing. Eliza usually joined them in the mornings, if only to maintain the appearance of domestic harmony before the servants. Her absence struck him as mildly unusual, though hardly alarming. "She is likely resting," he said dismissively. "My wife keeps tiresome hours of reflection." Charlotte raised an eyebrow with amused curiosity. "Still so devoted to her quiet dignity?" Alexander shrugged. "It suits her." A footman entered at that moment carrying a folded note upon a silver tray. "Your Grace," he said carefully, "this was delivered to the study early this morning." Alexander accepted the envelope with mild impatience. The seal bore the mark of the family lawyer. He broke it open without urgency, unfolding the letter as Charlotte continued her leisurely breakfast. Yet as his eyes moved across the page, the careless ease in his posture began to dissolve. The room seemed suddenly colder. Charlotte noticed the change immediately. "What is it?" she asked. Alexander did not answer at first. His gaze remained fixed upon the neat handwriting that filled the page. It was not the lawyer's words that struck him most deeply. It was the message enclosed within them. The Duchess of Blackwood had departed the manor during the night. Her personal chambers were empty. Several items belonging to her had been removed, though the greater portion of her possessions remained untouched. According to the stablemaster's account, she had left quietly by carriage under instructions given days earlier. Alexander lowered the letter slowly. For the first time in many years, genuine confusion crossed his expression. "Impossible," he murmured. Charlotte tilted her head. "What is impossible?" "My wife has gone." The word sounded strange even to him. Charlotte laughed softly, assuming the remark to be a joke. "Gone where?" Alexander read the letter again, his brow tightening with disbelief. There is no destination mentioned. Only that she left willingly. The quiet that followed felt heavier than the morning mist outside the windows. Charlotte leaned forward with sudden interest. "Surely she will return. A duchess cannot simply disappear." Alexander folded the letter sharply. "She will return," he said, though the certainty in his voice felt thinner than usual. Yet as the hours passed, that certainty began to crumble. Servants searched the manor carefully. The housekeeper confirmed that Eliza's maid had been dismissed the previous evening under the pretense of illness. Several personal jewels were missing from the cabinet, though the majority remained untouched. Every detail suggested careful preparation. By afternoon the truth had settled into the silent corridors of Blackwood Manor like an unwelcome guest. The Duchess had not left in anger. She had left with intention. Alexander walked alone through the library where afternoon sunlight touched the long rows of books. The quiet pressed heavily around him, filled with memories he had once considered trivial. He recalled Eliza standing beside the piano, her fingers resting lightly upon the keys. He remembered the calm steadiness in her voice when she had spoken to him across the breakfast table. He remembered the look in her eyes the night he had returned to the ballroom with Charlotte on his arm. At the time he had mistaken that silence for obedience. Now it felt disturbingly like farewell. Late in the evening another letter arrived. This one bore a familiar hand. Alexander dismissed the servant and opened it alone in the study. The fire burned low, casting flickering shadows across the walls where portraits of past Blackwood dukes watched with quiet judgment. The letter was brief. Eliza's handwriting moved gracefully across the page, each word measured and deliberate. She wrote without bitterness. She explained that her departure had not been born of anger but necessity. A house where a wife's dignity could be so easily discarded was no place to raise a child. She had endured humiliation for the sake of duty, but she would not allow her child to inherit that silence. Alexander's breath caught as he read the final lines. She had discovered her pregnancy weeks earlier. The heir to Blackwood Manor now traveled somewhere beyond his reach. For several long moments he did not move. The realization struck him with a force greater than any scandal he had ever dismissed. Eliza had not taken jewels. She had not taken money. She had taken the future of his name. Alexander rose abruptly and crossed the room, staring out the dark window toward the distant road that disappeared beyond the estate gates. Somewhere beyond those hills a carriage had carried his wife into the night. Somewhere beyond his authority she now walked freely with the child who would one day bear his title. For the first time in his life Alexander Blackwood felt the full weight of something he had never feared before. Loss. The manor behind him stood vast and magnificent, filled with wealth, servants, and history. Yet in that moment it felt strangely hollow, as though its grand halls had been emptied of their true purpose. Alexander remained at the window long after the fire faded into embers. And far away beyond the quiet countryside, a young Duchess traveled toward a new life, carrying within her the one treasure the Duke of Blackwood could never reclaim.